On Tuesday, the country would rally behind the name Khalifah Williams after the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his request to stay his execution. Williams died by lethal injection, killed by the state of Missouri after being convicted of the 1998 murder of Felicia Gale. Both the governor and the Missouri Supreme Court were urged to call off the execution for many reasons. The racial bias of a majority white jury, Williams being black and Gale being white, DNA evidence not tying him to the murder, and even one of the former prosecutors agreeing that Williams' death sentence should be overturned. St. Louis County's prosecuting attorney, Wesley Bell, would comment on the situation saying, quote, "Even for those who disagree on the death penalty, when there's a shadow of a doubt of any defendant's guilt, the irreversible punishment of execution should not be an option." Joining me for a special No Capital report is Joya Thornton, who served in the fight to save Khalifah Williams' life through FLOC, the Faith Leaders of Color Coalition. Thank you for being here, Joya.
Thank you for having me, Marcus, and for bringing more attention to this case. Even though we had the ultimate end that we had this week, the death penalty still needs to be talked about, right? I'm so glad we have it on individuals' tongues now.
That's absolutely right. So let's just get into it then.
Yeah.
How are you feeling, and can you explain to our listeners what is your connection specifically to this case?
Right. So for me, I am the national director and senior policy strategist for an organization that I started called FLOC. And FLOC stands for the Faith Leaders of Color Coalition. And we engage and extend the access of policy information and also case information directly to Black communities, particularly Black communities of faith. So for me, my role in this case was to serve as an advocacy lead and also a strategy lead on mobilizing communities about Marcellus Khalifah Williams' case, his innocence, and just the overall issue with the American death penalty system, its fallacies, its flaws, its discrimination in this country, historically and also presently.
Absolutely. And we should note that over 50% of exonerations are Black people in the United States. So
Right.
something to
And
know
also,
about.
we've had 200 exonerations since 1973 from a death row that shows exculpatory evidence that an individual was innocent or has reason to be innocent of that crime.
Particularly if it is a Black person accused of killing a white person. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Those cases are almost kind of like the wink and the nod to historical racial terror violence of lynching. And it's no secret that some of the same Southern states that held on to lynching are holding on to the most heinous forms of executions, whether it be lethal injection, whether it be the gas chamber. And Marcus, you do know that death by a firing squad is still an option in our country. So when you talk about states that are enacting and sustaining capital punishment or the death penalty, it needs to be addressed because what you said about Prosecutor Bell, it is irreversible.
Yeah. And another thing to note would be that the family of Felicia Gale said that they supported him serving a life sentence as opposed to the death penalty, which would have given him more time to try his case. One other question, continuing in this line to make sure that we recognize Mr. Williams' humanity. Have you been in touch with his family? How are they doing? And if so, what can you share with us?
What I can share is I have been very closely connected to the lead organizer on the ground in St. Louis, M.L. Smith. M.L. Smith is one of the co-directors of Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And they get involved, engage, and educate the community about every single death penalty case in Missouri. ML has been very close to the family, close to his son. And at this time, while there was an outpouring of support from celebrities like Flavor Flav and Yvette Nicole Brown, and I also heard Stephen A. Smith's diatribe, they want privacy right now. They want privacy as they prepare for Marcellus Khalifah Williams arrangements. And I'm so glad that you acknowledge his name as an email. because while he was living inside, he was an imam. He was a Muslim spiritual leader inside, and that's who he is. You know, we talk about 1998. In 2024, he gave spiritual advising to individuals that are living on the inside.
That's powerful stuff. Let's tip a little bit more into that celebrity
Yeah.
angle. So I'm very curious how publicizing events like this happens. I know the Innocence Project had a lot to do with this case. Um, when celebrities decide to speak up or when they hear about things like this, do you think that lends some value to cases like this, to the possibility of having things overturned? Or do you think maybe they working behind the scenes is more useful? How do you think that relationship should or could work for the best?
I'm glad you asked that question, Marcus. We need both and. Celebrities have a platform. They have a platform where if they was to tweet one thing out, then thousands upon millions of people would be able to be mobilized in that moment for that action, whether it was a petition, whether it was to call Governor Parsons, who probably took off his phone off the latch because he has so many calls. But that one action can mobilize individuals and allow them to pay more attention to cases on a state level. Marcellus Khalifa Williams was executed and killed by the state of Missouri. The blood is on their hands on Tuesday. We have two executions on today. Emmanuel Littlejohn in Oklahoma, Alan Miller in Alabama, and we have a couple of more coming in October. Who are we doing this for? You mentioned that the victim's family, and I work with a victim's family group called Journey to Hope, to say that executions don't serve them, that they wish they had counseling, that they wish that those funds could be allocated for something else. So we have to ask these questions. Do we as a state have the right to kill these individuals? And who are we killing for? There's a campaign that says, "Not in my name." And it basically says that residents of these states are saying, please do not kill these individuals in my name.
Yeah, and that's one thing we like to talk about with No Capital is making sure that the people who are just yelling at us to vote understand that the problem is actually bigger than that. And so if we get into this question about the death penalty and who it actually serves, it's something we
Yeah,
have to think about. The fact that Mr. Williams was the third of five scheduled to be executed this week, as you pointed out.
right.
And despite the fact that many people support the death penalty, a part of that for maybe many abolitionists, for example, is to say that a system of punishment as a result or a response or consequence to crime doesn't necessarily stop people from committing crimes, doesn't put them in a position to be successful in life, doesn't help them in their families, doesn't help their communities, doesn't serve anything except to harm the people who have been punished and to put a financial burden on the state. So one of the interesting things about the death penalty is how much money it costs to hold
Mm.
somebody on death row and how much the state takes advantage of killing people to take that money off the books. Another interesting fact in this context, uh, during the Donald Trump administration, more people were sentenced and killed, I should say, on death row than the previous 56 years combined. But for all the folks that want to say vote, 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 Donald Trump's not the president right now. So it's one of those things where we have to be thoughtful about how these situations come together. So the question for you then, how can justice be served beyond the court? In other words, if we're relying on the same system that brought us mass incarceration, stop and frisk policing, the now indicted Eric Adams, mayor of New York, right? That kind of won't cut it. So we know you're doing your part. What else do you think we can collectively do to be free and to get money out of this system's hands? How do we solve this? We can't all be lawyers, right? But what can we do?
Policy, policy, policy. Right now, there are current bills on the floor in various states that have been trying to make it past the finish line, that each of us in various states were to call our state representatives, whether they be representatives or senators, to say, we want this bill to pass. We want this bill to make it out of committee. We want this bill to make it to the floor. HB 999 in Pennsylvania, right? So there's a bill, an intellectual disabilities bill in Georgia that lowers the burden of proof when it comes to individuals that have intellectual disabilities claim, which is formerly mental retardation claim. And there's a law, Atkins versus Virginia, that you cannot execute individuals with intellectual disabilities. Where in Georgia, we've been trying to get that bill passed for a number of years. Call your lawmakers and say that you will support a bill like that. There's also a death penalty abolition bill on the floor in Ohio, in Nevada, in Texas. Call your lawmakers and say that you support these bills. And you talked about individuals that support the death penalty. Well, the death penalty is highly unpopular. There are more people that are voting for life in prison, life without parole, life with parole, than the death penalty. Every time one of these cases arises, people always ask me, the death penalty still exists? Oh, yes. It exists in this civilized country that we live in, and it is held in the hands of a lot of white Republican governors who have hardened their hearts, who have turned their ears away from their constituents in regards to killing in their name. So I would always say support policies, support laws, get educated about the death penalty laws in your states. Because we know the death penalty, Marcus, is not sexy. People are talking about mass incarceration, mandatory minimums, youth justice, but I feel like it's a very low hanging fruit when it talks about us as a country and our identity as a country.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add too is organize. Be organized locally. So one of the biggest problems, I'm a professor of political science. One of the biggest problems with the United States is that representatives aren't representative. They're actually
Mm,
not doing the things that people want. And the only way that we can make that happen, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. So we have to
yes.
make them do this. And so it's not always the case that we can just ask and be nice about it or say the rules are there, right? To your point, the Americans with Disability Act came in 1990 and it's not enforced almost ever. And so one of the things we also need to do is organize. I wanna close out uh, with your final thoughts. And as you give them, I want to remind the listeners that Mr. Williams' final quote, the last thing that he shared was all praises be to Allah in every situation. So those are his final words. I want to leave you with some final thoughts and then we'll close out.
I was so touched by what he said, because he did command his soul back to God, back to Allah. We need more people on the front lines with us, organizing with these cases that are irreversible. You have organizations like the ACLU, the Innocence Project, Equal Justice USA, EJI. If you are conservative, conservatives concerned. There are conservatives that are on the front line when you talk about fiscal responsibility and how in Louisiana they spent $7.7 million to sustain the death penalty, even though they hadn't executed in 13 years. So I will say there are some cases that are coming up, and we need you. We don't need you in the ninth hour to talk about Marcellus Williams' case. We need you right now to talk about Richard Moore's case in South Carolina. We need you to talk about Warren King's case in Georgia, and we need you to talk about Tremaine Wood's case in Oklahoma. So do your research on those cases. Contact me at Joya and ATL, and I can plug you into those types of groups that are already organizing, that are already drafting policies to combat the death penalty system in America that does not serve Black and Brown people and people that do not have access to adequate counsel.
Thank you so much, Joy. And thank you for your work, for your
So
commitment. A
thank
lot
you,
of people,
Marcus.
we do this thing where we recognize that people, go to school and get all these degrees and sometimes they keep their
These commas,
distance.
these
Right.
commas, right?
That's right. But I think it's always something, important to acknowledge when people don't turn their back on community. They don't turn their back on their
Right.
beliefs and their values. It's something that everybody needs to understand. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
This situation leaves us without words. We're all speechless. In this moment, we're angry, we're frustrated. People are crying out for help. And we have to tell them more than just go vote. We need to tell them how to be involved, how to be engaged. We need to treat people right, and we need to show up for one another. We may be speechless, but Khalifah Williams left us with his poetry. We thank him for that, and may he rest in power. I'm Marcus Board. This is Comedy Hype News with no capital. We'll be back to talk to you again soon.